Hello, everyone, and welcome to CG webinar number 256. I'm Xinxu from Oxford Department of Education, and today we'll be hearing from two experts, Chengxin Pan and Tony Welch, on the topic geopolitical tensions and their implications for Australia-China relations in higher education. Dr. Chengxin Pan is Associate Professor of International Relations at Deakin University and an Adjunct Associate Professor at the Australia-China Relations Institute, University of Technology, Sydney. Tony Welch is Professor of Education at University of Sydney. Both speakers have extensive research and academic experiences in Australia and China, and also have numerous publications on relevant issues. We're very sorry that Professor Li Chuan will not be able to join us today due to illness, and we really hope that she'll feel better soon. And so before I hand over to our speakers, there are some brief housekeeping points to mention. So firstly, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website in due course. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when speaking and asking a question. We recommend using the speaker's view so that you can more clearly see who is talking. And to ask a question, please use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you'll be invited to ask it yourself directly. And then when invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you're from. So without further ado, I'll now pass over to Chengxin and Tony for today's CG webinar.
Okay, thank you, Xinxi, and thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk. And my broad topic is on the emerging dynamics of Australia-China relations. I see this relationship has really been a textbook example of relationship breakdown. By that I mean there are two aspects of this relationship which are really not going well. Firstly, China has basically imposed trade sanctions or created trade barriers to many Australian exports to China, such as barley, lobsters, wine, timber, beef, and coal, which total maybe worth about 20 billion Australian dollars. One of the very few benefit of the banning of the lobster export, for example, has been that many Australians have been able to afford lobsters for a long time on the dinner table. Another one is that the Australia and China are in this very deep diplomatic freeze, and Australia has been unable to basically to talk to its Chinese counterparts. Many ministers, their call went basically unanswered. And I think the last time Australian Prime Minister went to China was about 5 years ago. So the relationship certainly hasn't been going well. And according to Prime Minister Scott Morrison, all the tensions comes down to the fact that Australia has just been Australia. So basically, it has nothing to do with Australia. We are just been who we are. It is China that has changed. And indeed, many observers and media commentators would agree on this. They believe that, especially since the coming to power of President Xi Jinping, China has become more aggressive overseas and more repressive at home, with so many issues ranging from Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and that trap diplomacy, the very ambitious and expensive BRI, and so on and so forth. So I think there's some truth to the changing Chinese diplomatic posture, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, for example, that has created this increasing tensions between China and many of its neighbors, and including Australia. But I think the relationship need to be looked at from both aspects, because we all know it takes two to tango. You might ask why Australia has been in this kind of a particular deep phase with China. And why now, if Australia has always been Australia, but why this relationship has suffered the setbacks in recent years? So here I wouldn't talk about the why question, because it's a long story, I guess. I will mainly focus on the chronological aspect of these interactions between these two countries, and then wrap up with some of my observations about the what this kind of emerging dynamics in the relationship means. I think talking about the chronological interactions between Australia and China, we might think about this turning point in this relationship, which was last year, in April 2020, when the Australian Foreign Minister openly called for an independent inquiry into the COVID-19 origins in China. And Scott Morrison followed up with the suggestion that the WHO should be given weapons inspector power to go in to have a look. And this really angered China. And then all the trade measures followed. And China's anger with Australia perhaps had been fermenting for quite a period of time, which may go back to a decade ago even. For example, 10 years ago, Australia was the place Obama declared his pivot to Asia policy, and Australia decided to accept 2,500 US Marines to rotate through Darwin. And in 2012, Australia banned Huawei from participating in its national broadband network project. Also between 2013 and 2015, there was a brief calm before the current storm. Then after 2015, the Australian media began to zoom in on this issue of Chinese influence. So I have been living in Australia for quite a long time, and it's really noticeable, the change of narrative. So this suddenly came out of nowhere, it seems. Then this constant talk about Chinese influence, Chinese interference operations, then justified the passage of two legislations in Australian Parliament. One is the Espionage and the Foreign Interference Act 2018, and the other is Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme 2018. And in the same year, Huawei was also banned from taking part in Australia's 5G project. So the and about 1 year ago, another Foreign Relations Act was passed with a very fast speed in order to basically to scrap the Victoria government's agreement or MOU with China on Belt and Road Initiative. And fast forward to this year, in April, there began the talk of the drums of war over Taiwan in the by the Australian government and in the media as well. So then a few months later, we all know was the creation of the AUKUS alliance, the pact between Australia, the UK, and the United States. And I haven't mentioned Australia's role in the push for the renaming the region as the Indo-Pacific, and the revival of the Quad. So Australia certainly was a quite active player, as it very often wanted to be part of at the center of action. So in a way, its wish has come true in many respects in the regional geopolitical competition. And what does all this tell us about this relationship? I think 5 quick points I'd like to mention. First one is the so-called China choice, the topic proposed by the ANU Professor White. This choice basically has already been made, and China was not Australia's choice as a strategic partner. And indeed, this relationship, I think, has reached a point of no return. And also, secondly, there is this pervasive securitization of almost everything Chinese in Australia, and the Australian-China relationship has been interpreted almost always through this values lens, and this has also left very little room for dissent or debate even. And certainly, I think the media and the think tank narrative has begun to saturate the public opinion and even deep into subconsciousness. To give you one example, at the recent COP26 meeting, Scott Morrison was meant to say the global momentum to tackle climate change is building, but instead he said the global momentum to tackle China is building. So sometimes you just couldn't help because China has always been in the headlines. And fourthly, this breakdown has really reached not only in diplomacy, economy, or security, but also has basically poisoned the broader social people-to-people relationship, including education, including tourism. There's a survey earlier this year about Chinese Australians. 1 in 5 of them experienced physical threat or attacks, and 1 in 3 experienced verbal attacks or racial slurs. And I would say, yeah, I was one of them. Although I did not participate in this survey, but I certainly experienced physical threat and attacks myself earlier this year. And the fifth point is that this breakdown need to be understood in the US-China geopolitical rivalry context. So it is not just about Australia-China relationship. It is this part of this broad geopolitical dynamics. And if we think about the importance or centrality of US primacy and Australia's long invested Australian-US alliance insurance policy, we could more easily understand why Australia has doubled down on the relationship through such as the recently created AUKUS. So arguably, the Australia's position on China is one of the very few tangible achievements made by the United States pivot to Asia policy. So I think my time is probably up. What does all this mean for international education or other issues? I will leave this to the expert on this panel. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chengxin. That's really helpful to have this grand pictures about the Australia-China geopolitical tensions and the background and the historical trajectories. And with this, I think we will welcome Anthony to talk more about the education and higher education engagement parts of this.
Thank you, Xuxin. Thank you to Chengxin for putting us in the picture in terms of the overall state of deteriorating China-Australia relations and the major elements and how it has evolved quite dramatically in recent years. I'm going to focus on the higher ed picture and in particular to look at some of the implications of the picture that Chengxin has painted in terms of the implications of research collaboration and the pressure for scientific decoupling. For those of you less familiar with the Australian context, it's perhaps worthwhile just pointing out one or two elements that help in understanding. The first would be that Australia has been grappling with this tension between, on the one hand, having China as a major trading partner, so that we are in many ways enmeshed with the Chinese economy. And as Chengxin indicated, a lot of our exports go to China, or at least they did until recently. But the other element is more, the other side of that is that we see the US as our major ally in strategic terms. And so while a number of countries, particularly in our part of the world, the countries of ASEAN, are grappling with that tension, it is particularly important to understand that in the Australian context. It is that tension is something that is front and center in terms of the dilemmas that Australia faces. we had, until recently, thought we could have our cake and eat it too, but that's increasingly become unlikely. The other element is more specific to higher education, and that is that our higher ed system is peculiarly reliant on fees and income from international students. And so the whole COVID crisis and the increasing tensions with China has forced some reconsideration of some of that. So those 2 points are more introductory, if you like. I'm going to look, as I indicated, particularly at the implications of the deteriorating relations between China and Australia for higher education, and in particular for scientific collaboration. I want to use the notion of culture wars to some extent to help us get a handle on how we understand this. We're familiar with the notion of culture wars, I guess, at least in general terms. Some of you will know that its origin comes from the US and the work of James Davison Hunter, who developed the term in 1991 to try and account for increasing polarization in US politics. It's somewhat ironic given that that's now 30 years ago. I wonder what he would think given the current state of US politics. But the term has evolved and now has much wider implication. It still refers basically to the struggle between two sets of conflicting values or worldviews. And it's now routinely applied to things like identity, to gender, to religion, to migration, and so on. Here, I'm going to use it to account for the pressure for scientific the pressure for scientific decoupling in Australia to decouple from scientific collaboration with China. The COVID crisis of the last couple of years has only exacerbated the trend towards polarization. Countries are being pushed to choose between either the US or China, whether they wish to or not, and many don't. This includes higher education and research, and it's that I want to focus on now. The implications are quite substantial. As a Chinese-American particle physicist argued just recently, scientific decoupling holds multiple drawbacks. For example, in the US, more than 50% of artificial intelligence, AI researchers in the US were from outside the US, and of those, half were Chinese. In Australia too, the implications are quite profound. If you look at Australian papers co-authored with Chinese colleagues, these rose from 4% of the total in 1996 to 14% in 2009, and quite likely more again since. Again, this is set against the increasing trend towards internationally co-authored publications. Some of you will have seen the Royal Society document of about 10 years ago that looked at this, and it showed that worldwide, something like 35% of all publications nowadays result from authors from two separate countries. That's increased markedly. That's the pattern across the world. In Australia, it's even more significant. It's 45%. So 45% of all Australian publications are the result of a collaboration with someone from another system. So anything that threatens that international collaboration could have quite profound consequences. If we look at one of our major research-intensive universities, for example, the University of Queensland. Its chancellor recently pointed out that collaboration with China just at his university had resulted in more than 3,000 publications, with a citation count around 3 times the world average. So these two examples from the US and from Australia underline that China is a scientific powerhouse. This is no news, but it bears restating in the current context. It recently overtook the United States as the largest source of publications and is now first in the world for high citation papers in mathematics and computer science and engineering, not far behind. China is now second in both PCT patents and overall citations worldwide. We're all familiar with the ranking and league tables that are so prominent nowadays. If you look at those, you can see and chart the dramatic rise of China's leading universities in those league tables, whichever one you look at. If you look at Shanghai Jiaotong, for example, the academic ranking of world universities, which was the first, and in many ways is still the most reliable indicator simply of research output. It doesn't pretend to do anything else. If you looked at the ranking of Chinese universities a decade ago, you would have seen a handful in the top 500. There are now 58. So something like 12% of the leading 500 universities in the world are now mainland Chinese. And there are at least 3 in the top 100. So what are the implications for Australia? Well, China is now a key knowledge partner for Australia, including in key scientific fields. Data from 2018 showed that something like 16% of Australian publications involved a China-affiliated researcher. So something like 1 in 6 of total publications. When asked, Australian researchers show that they don't wish to be pushed into choosing between the US and China. But the increasingly rancorous and rivalrous US-China relations that Chengxin pointed to is leading to increasing pressure to restrict scientific collaboration. It hasn't been explicit, but there are strong intimations that there has been US pressure applied to its allies to align themselves with the US position, which is strongly anti-China. The US, as we know, is in some ways more polarized now than it has been perhaps ever. But if there is one thing that unites Republicans and Democrats and right across the political spectrum, it is, as the Americans sometimes say, the Chinese are eating our lunch. So this sense that China is a rival is something that is very strong in the US. And as I say, there are indications that pressure is being applied to its allies to align themselves with that position. And that includes then a whole host of measures, and Chengxin has alluded to some of them in relation to the Foreign Interference Act and so on. This is applied directly to universities. So one index of how extreme this has become is that every Australian university now has a foreign interference officer. And all universities are supposed to check all of their China relations. The risk, of course, here is that the baby is thrown out with the bathwater, and some of the measures that have been adopted and foisted on universities have indeed been very blunt. They haven't really distinguished between a more nuanced and sensitive approach to scientific collaboration that might distinguish between, let's say, sensitive high-tech projects, some with perhaps dual use potential, the kinds of areas that China highlighted in its Made in China 2025 policy, things like AI, robotics, new materials, quantum mechanics, and so on, quantum technology, photonics, and the broad mass of research that may be done with China, which embraces, of course, the social sciences and humanities and don't present any risk to anyone. So our approach has been relatively blunt so far. As Dennis Simon, who some of you will know, is an expert on China's scientific rise and was until recently a senior executive at Deakin, as he argued, to assume a comprehensive conspiracy, which is the risk we run, I think, is far from reality. So basically, I'm arguing that a culture war, particularly one that's imported from the US, is no basis for sensible, mature decisions regarding international scientific collaboration. And I think Australia runs the risk of not having a more sophisticated response and approach to preserve as much as possible of the very important scientific and research collaboration links with China. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you so much, Chengxin, for your fabulous discussions. And I wonder if there are comments or questions from the audience. Please feel free to use the chat function to leave your questions there. And while giving some time for our audience to leave their questions, I have one question for you. I'll be taking advantage of my position as the chair, perhaps. So you've talked about how the geopolitical tensions could influence the people's level, and that in the higher education and universities that could include academics and researchers. And I wonder how about the, like, for instance, students, like Australian students and international students. I wonder if there are anything you would like to discuss in that regard, please.
I'm not sure who should answer that question. Perhaps I'll make a few comments and then Chengxin may come in too. It's a good point. It's a good question. Part of the risk, and I've covered this in some other recent publications, part of the risk is that anti-China sentiment, the kinds of incidents that Chengxin alluded to earlier, the temperature is raised and a kind of undifferentiated anti-Chinese and sometimes anti-Asian sentiment can rise. This is not specific, unfortunately, it's not unique to Australia. We see some of the same issues arising in the UK, in the US, and so on. Fanned, it has to be said, by some very poor media coverage. That again is tends to portray China as a rival and to be blamed for a whole host of things. So the temperature has risen. There have been some incidents in a number of Australian universities involving conflicts between different groups of students. In some cases, more nationalist elements who feel that China is being attacked. And then on the other hand, those who are more critical and sometimes hypercritical of anything that China does. So there have been a number of incidents on several campuses, and they haven't always been very, very well handled. Chengxin, do you want to add?
Thanks, Anthony. I did not pay close attention to the incidents. Usually, I just I did hear about, for example, at the Monash, at the Melbourne Uni, at University of Queensland. There have been this kind of tensions between local students, if you like, and Chinese students in protests involving the issue of Hong Kong, and also involving student elections. I think at the Monash, there was this proposal that among the local students, if you like, the criteria for being able to be elected to be changed according to their ability to the hours they could work, which basically is to limit foreign students, because foreign students' visa conditions require them to only work below a certain amount of hours. And yeah, and also there has been the report about Australian government began to train students to spot spies on campus. That I'm not sure whether this has really been carried out or not. But the fact that this kind of issues are considered is really interesting.
Thank you so much. I wonder if there are things to add to this point from the speakers. If not, we will invite our audience. Firstly, could I invite Trif to ask her question, please?
Hi, this is Victorica Trif. Thank you very much, Xin Su. Congratulations for both presenters for today. In my opinion, the strategic engagement is opposed to the geopolitical tensions. Could you define the areas for cooperation during COVID crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps I can start on that one. So I think what has to be distinguished is, if you like, some of the high-tech areas in which there are some concerns about IP, intellectual property. There are some concerns about some of these areas being used for dual use technology with potential military application, and the rest, which are of no strategic concern at all. So the areas, Victoria, I think that are generally cited as being of concern would be those ones, broadly speaking, as I indicated, listed by China in its Made in China 2025 policy and subsequently. So areas like artificial intelligence, robotics, new materials, photonics and quantum applications, those kinds of areas would be the ones that I think there would be some concern about in some cases. But there's a whole host of collaboration with China, many of it of long standing, and as I indicated, in a context where China is one of Australia's leading knowledge partners in a range of areas that are not really problematic, but are nonetheless covered by this foreign interference legislation and, as Chengxin indicated, a general emphasis at the moment on securitization of a range of policy areas that were never considered to be so influenced by security concerns. Chengxin, do you want to add anything?
Maybe just 2 quick points. One is that I think the conventional assumption is that China is still in this kind of a position of spying or espionage in scientific research. So China is always the one who steals secrets, steal intellectual property. I think this has been basically propagated by the media to associate theft with Chinese. I think this is not healthy because in many ways we, in the West, in Australia, in the United States, we attracted talent from China. And we of course do not call this theft or steal. We said we attract talent and from China to work on our campuses, in our labs, to co-create knowledge, to invent things. So from the beginning, Chinese students, Chinese researchers are part of this creation of new knowledge. And so if we just think that they are here to steal, that basically has got this relationship wrong from the very beginning. Maybe I'm not saying that there is no such thing as intellectual property theft or espionage, but broadly speaking, to be fair to the vast majority of people who are hardworking, who are really wanting to pursue a career in science, in research, in education, etc., they should not be blamed with this very broad stroke of the brush. So that's one point. Another is that you mentioned the Made in China 2025. I think we can understand yet why other countries are wary of China's policy to pursue this kind of high-tech dominance, if you like. But also we need to think about the context of this kind of policy, why China wants to pursue leading role in this. That's partly because in these areas, China have experienced this kind of the technology being dominated by the United States in particular. So it felt that without catching up, China would continue to be in this kind of technologically dependent position. And so in a way, I think this kind of a competition, if we put geopolitical implications aside, it's not necessarily something that we should worry about. We can welcome, because no country and no particular civilization, if you like, should monopolize technology all the time. And throughout history, technology, science, knowledge have been transferring, have been diffusing across continents, across national boundaries all the time. And so if China could, for example, find a cure for cancer, and why is that a bad thing? Why should we be fearful of that? And so we can benefit from each other. But of course, this is ideal context. In today's environment, this has been really put into this zero-sum game. And China's win is the West loss and vice versa. I think that's part of the problem. Just my quick.
One thing I should perhaps have pointed out before is that mainland colleagues are now an important part of the Australian scientific and academic workforce. So they play a valuable role, not only as specialists in engineering or forestry or international relations, but also helping Australia forge those important links to the Chinese, the very powerful Chinese research system. In talking with mainland colleagues working here, they sometimes feel that their work in their specialist area is valued, but the additional work they do in forging relations with China tends not to be valued as much.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much. Yes, please, Chengxin, do you have things to add?
No.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Victoria. And sorry if I pronounced your name in the wrong order before. And then could I next invite Celia to ask the next question, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Celia Whitchurch, University College London. Yes, it was very useful indeed to have this update. I hadn't appreciated quite the extent of the deterioration of relations between Australia and China. I've been around quite a long time, and it puts me in mind of Cold War days when I worked in several universities in the UK, in a range of faculties actually, and certainly pre-1990, I was involved working with visiting scholars from China and Russia and Eastern Europe. And I have to say, it was very impressive the way that individual academics managed to develop these relations, and quite often professional associations such as the UK Royal Society or the British Council, even the Quakers, managed to forge these links and bring scholars over. And this was at the height of the Cold War, particularly in the 80s and early 90s, when things were opening up, certainly in the early 90s. So I suppose I just want to offer a note of optimism in that policy is actually often influenced by practice on the ground of individual scholars. And you were hinting at that in your last comment. So I think I understand the kind of security issues, military issues, but I think academics are quite creative in ways they find to continue relations in bad times. So we'll see how it pans out, but I think there are precedents.
Well, yes, there are. And some of us who've looked at these sorts of events in a longer time perspective, and I think you're alluding to, Celia, will remember the response of the US in particular, but to a lesser extent the UK and Australia too, to Sputnik and the rise of Soviet-Russian science in the 1950s. And it provoked very, very similar sorts of responses, including in my field a great deal of intense attention to Soviet education. Suddenly everyone wanted to know about what the Soviets were doing in their schools, that seem to be so successful. So that could be one good thing that might come out of this. We might spend a little more time looking at Chinese education and what their strengths are. But I agree, there are definitely precedents here, and it's instructive, I think, to see many of the same kinds of responses, somewhat troubling, but very similar in some ways to the sorts of measures that were put in place in response to earlier episodes where the US felt threatened, or felt its technological dominance threatened.
Thank you. Sometimes perhaps the allies of the US, so-called allies, may be in a better position to do this than US scholars themselves. I don't know, but there are channels. There's still channels, I think, that can remain open.
Yes, and I'm sure Chengxin might have much the same. My experience is that my networks of collaboration with colleagues in China are as they always were. They're fine. They are uninterrupted, but it's the more formal institutional arrangements that are threatened.
Yeah, thanks, Celia. Yeah, I like the optimism you expressed. I think in many ways the media tend to focus on the negative stories, and the vast majority of the stories are unremarkable. It's day-to-day routine, which does not make it into the headlines, but these are the things that keep the world together in many ways. And so, yeah, I share that hope. I think myself, I was a beneficiary of these China-Australian university exchange programs. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to come to Australia to do a PhD. And so those unremarkable aspects, I think in the end, I hope will help counterbalance the overly negative and the securitized narratives.
Thank you so much for the speakers and for Celia for the question to leave us with a positive note. And I'm aware that we're reaching the end of the session. So can I invite the next two questions from David and then Kexing, and then perhaps our speakers will respond to the two questions together with any final concluding thoughts you may have. So first of all, can I invite David to speak, please?
Thank you very much. My academic career started as a Soviet studies specialist, and I was a lecturer in international communism. I think it's quite risky to draw close parallels between the USSR in the 70s and 80s and China today. I think one key difference is that there was a loss of popular legitimacy in the USSR before it collapsed. There is no loss of popular legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. I think we delude ourselves if we believe that the leadership of China is unpopular in China. It is popular in China. It's seen as successful. It is seen as a regime which has dealt well with COVID and a regime which deserves respect. And I think that this should inform our view about the kind of intellectual discourse that we have with Chinese colleagues. Like other speakers in this meeting, I have enormous respect for what has been achieved by Chinese colleagues, by Chinese universities, and the richness of intellectual inquiry in China. But I do not think that we can expect them to engage in potentially risky discourse in public when their reflex is always going to be to stand alongside the regime of China. They're very sensitive to any sense that they are in some way breaking the line. in the chatter put a point about academic tribes. Let's remember that academic culture is extremely complicated, and it's really that contribution that I wanted to make rather than asking any particular question.
Thank you, David, for your comments. And next, can I invite Ke-Xin to speak, please?
Thank you, Xin. And thank you, Professor Chengxin and Anthony, for the thought-provoking discussion. I wonder what's your observation and reflection on the research collaboration in social sciences and humanities. As you mentioned, there are less strategic interests in these disciplines, and also maybe less policy discourse or media coverage in this area as well. So I'm curious how you understand the trend, and how do you think like COVID might influence all the things. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ke-Xin. And I'll pass on to Anthony and Chengxin.
Chengxin, do you want to start on that one?
I'm not an expert, so it's just my own anecdotal observation, I guess, in terms of the collaboration in the humanities and the social sciences. I think there's a lot to gain from collaboration. Well, at the moment, I think the collaboration has been growing fast in comparison to the past. Still, there's a lot of gap to be bridged, if you like. In particular, there are many issue areas which are very sensitive in terms of human rights, democracy, political systems, governance, etc. So, but these issues are precisely, they require this kind of a cross-cultural perspectives, because we tend to see this in international relations. There is this reflection on how knowledge is produced, which is very much Eurocentric or Western-centric, at the expense of knowledge produced elsewhere. And I think, given China's experience, its rise, its development, I think it would be a loss, a missed opportunity for us in the West not to understand its experience in its own terms, at least, or try to understand how and why, etc. Not necessarily agree with the findings or your Chinese colleagues, but this kind of dialogue is the very center of knowledge innovation and production. So, yeah, I would certainly think that this is something that we need to work on. But in the Australian-China context, I'm not particularly optimistic. So,
yeah, I think I largely agree with Chengxin on that. Let me maybe just add one or 2 points, and that is well, a couple of points. Firstly, in the Chinese research system, there is a major emphasis on science and technology. So although there is support for social science and humanities research, the big money, if you like, tends to go to science and technology. The second point is that for anyone who doesn't read and speak Chinese, there's a whole lot that we're missing in terms of Chinese social science and humanities research. When you engage with colleagues and talk with them one-on-one or at forums and so on, you find that there's a lot that you simply haven't read because you can only read in English. And there's a great deal of Chinese social science research that we simply never get to see because it's in Chinese. And that is something of a dilemma for Chinese researchers. On the one hand, the incentives, if you like, are there to publish in English, and there's considerable pressure, performance pressure, particularly at the leading universities, Fudan, Beida, Tsinghua, and so on, to publish in major journals in English, which of course is not easy in your second language. But on the other hand, it is still the case, particularly in the social sciences, to some extent in science and technology too, although rather differently, that the leading figures in the social sciences and humanities are often older Chinese professors whose entire career has been working in Chinese language. So for young scholars, they need to do both. They need to publish in English so that they get promotion and so on. On the other hand, if they only publish in English, no one in China, or at least the leading figures in China, will know who they are. So they need to publish in their own language as well. So I'm regularly impressed with the depth and breadth of Chinese colleagues working in the social sciences and humanities. But I'm also well aware that there's a whole world of Chinese science, social science and humanities research that those who don't speak and read Chinese simply never get to see.
Thank you so much, Anthony and Chengxin. I think all of the points are really spot on. And thank you again for this really fascinating session that opens up so much room for further reflections and discussions. Thank you for all the audience as well. The recording and transcription will be posted on CG website soon. And just to remind everyone that our next CG webinar is this Thursday on the topic about student agency in changing UK higher education. You can find the details in the chat area, and you're more than welcome to join us again. So thank you, take care everyone, and bye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.